Thank you. What a great turnout. Rembrandt would be delighted, and while we were waiting, he'd probably be sitting there sketching your faces and bodies and studying your expressions. Rembrandt is controversial. It's controversial as to which works he actually did. Attributions have been changing in recent years. The ones I'll be showing are not controversial. We won't be getting into the whole attributions problem. And it's controversial as to what sort of person he was. In the 19th century and most of the 20th, he was described as a very noble person, sort of suffering. And then recent years, he was described by a couple of scholars especially as nasty, vindictive, avaricious, malicious. So you have the range from someone who is fabulous as a human being to someone who is rather despicable. We don't really have sufficient evidence, documentary evidence, to be sure. Everything that can be argued negatively can be argued positively about his character. But he was admired in his own day, and he still is admired greatly for his ability to depict human beings and to suggest what was very prized in early modern Europe, to depict the inner state, the inner feelings through the actions of the body. And the way he did this changed over time, but it's something that always held his interest. He did landscapes, he occasionally sketched animals, but human beings in various situations are really what concerned him most. I thought I would start with this one, which is an amusing self-portrait and etching wide-eyed. He did a lot of paintings, drawings, prints of himself. They sold. People were interested in acquiring portraits of Rembrandt, especially as his reputation increased. They were also a way for him to study a human face, because a self-portrait is the only situation where the artist knows what is being felt inside and can observe the external appearance. With everyone else, you get just the external appearance. So he would act out, various anger, laughter, surprise, and try to sketch that.
Excuse me, Professor. We're just trying to figure out the audio because I think that your microphone isn't working.
Well, both lights are on. So if you could.
It's not very clear at the back here, is it? I don't quite what. I'm not the person to ask about.
Yes.
Audio.
If the mic were moved, would that make a difference?
And I've got. Oh, if these were moved.
I don't know if it were moved toward.
If you move it a little bit closer to you.
Okay, let's see. Let's try up here. Oops. My grandsons would be very impressed at all this equipment on me. They're little. Okay. Is this better? Is this any better? No. Well, I'll just try to talk louder. That's about all I can do. 35, biblical, a lot of biblical scenes, Old Testament and New Testament. This is the writing on the wall, undecipherable. Balthazar, during his feast, using dishes from the Temple of Jerusalem, which is obviously sacrilegious to be doing, sees the writing on the wall. He doesn't know what it says. Rembrandt shows the astonishment, the absolute astonishment of something supernatural happening on a wall. And you can see the gestures of surprise and objects being spilled. Goblet here, goblet there. Trying to suggest, not just through the face, but through actions that happen, what is going on. And early Rembrandt, fairly detailed, an emphasis on action. He also has quiet scenes, but he is very interested in being the Dutch Rubens with energy, physical energy. Daniel figures out what it says, and it's your days are numbered. You will be punished for this. Emotions obviously were important to Renaissance artists as well, and they depicted them. Leonardo was the best. But notice the difference. The Last Supper, so familiar. Things look orderly. He has studied, given different reactions to different apostles, but they are in neat groups of 3 as they're reacting. Rembrandt has the sense of a moment. This is split second. And by the way, he got probably from a print, because that's how he knew Italian art. The salt cellar that Judas has overturned, you can't see it because the fresco is in terrible shape, but the salt cellar Judas overturned in his surprise at what Christ said, one of you will betray me. Rembrandt has the overturned goblet, same idea. This is Rembrandt's copy, drawing, after the Leonardo. Yeah, shame the images can't be higher because some of you have to do a lot of shifting position to see. And notice that he has started messing up the symmetry. Move the curtain, and he's having some of the heads rise higher. So it looks more spontaneous. You don't see so much individual faces here, but the whole composition is suggesting that Christ has said, actually there are a number of things. It's both the Eucharist being instituted, but also one of you will betray me. And the reactions are to the one of you will betray me. It is in focus. This is a chalk drawing, and this is an ink sketch, very loose, very quick. So, and here he's going further. He's taking Leonardo and he's really moving the figures around so that there's no longer this order that is a stilled order. It is, someone gets up completely from the table. Someone leans back because others are saying, do you know, or are you the one who will betray him? You have that kind of greater movement of the whole group and agitation because of what Christ has said. Now, Rembrandt is not unique in doing this. If you compare the same subject, the Old Testament David, Michelangelo's version, and Bernini's version. Bernini, the moment, moving into our space, about to throw the stone into our space, and the expression, pursed lips, concentration, gathering his strength, studied in a mirror apparently. That's a very momentary and individualized expression. This isn't individualized. So there's a sense of things that are momentary, that are specific, that are very immediate and close to the viewer. An increase in that with the 17th century. Caravaggio, Velázquez, other examples, and Rembrandt. Now, Rembrandt, his interest is more wide-ranging even than the other artists, and he returns to the problem of how to depict emotions in different ways more often. He explores the whole topic actively. This is a very sedate image. You don't find portraits with teeth showing. It was considered vulgar. If you smiled and your teeth were showing, that's what lower class people did, or well-brought-up people in private. But you would never have a portrait painting that way, and you wouldn't show yourself in public with all your teeth showing in a smile. So that's like Mona Lisa, a slight smile. Silver point drawing, his fiancée Saskia, silver point precious, very difficult, you can't make corrections. The day of their engagement, he does this record. Obviously very affectionate, slightly shadowed face. But I wanted to start with an attractive image of Saskia. These are drawings, and they're studies of emotion. Saskia in bed, probably Saskia, it's a woman, but most people assume that it's probably Saskia in bed, ill, bored. What happens to a face, the slackness, the boredom, frustration, really intense study. Probably awful company because he's not talking to her, he's just drawing while she's lying there. This is a detail. As you can see, there's a larger drawing. That's complete. Pen drawings, quick pen drawings. This is the strongest one, I think. Almost like, am I going to die? It's like a fear in the face or awe. Don't know why the white chalk. None of the sources I looked at had an explanation that made sense to me. But the face, the hand, and especially using the dark wash to suggest the really formidable feeling that she is experiencing. Without that wash, it wouldn't be as powerful. So technique is part of the conveying of emotions. The face, the body, and huddled into herself there. Now this one is quite fascinating because she's got 3 hands. If you think away this hand, she's thinking. It's not, this is depression, but this is musing. You're thinking about something more actively. You're musing. And that's what she's doing at this point. If you think away this hand, it's much more apathetic. So just one hand moved, it changes the way you read the whole pose. And that fascinates him. The expression on the face is not changed, but you read that expression differently depending on what he's doing with the hand. That's a drawing. Now this is the only other example of a woman with 3 arms. It's called the French bed colloquially because it's sex. So of course, French has nothing to do with French. Ledicant means a freestanding bed, not one of those built into the wall beds. And it's a formal print that he signed, dated, and sold. So they're in bed. And by the way, earlier books, now it's reproduced fully, but not often. Earlier books would show you the face, and the rest would be cut. Never showed the whole thing like this. So notice she has one arm that's embracing him and smiling. They're looking at each other. And then the other arm, the other left arm, oops, I can't cover that, but it's down. It's like a couple of minutes have passed maybe, or a different state of mind. And again, you read the whole body and expression differently depending which arm you focus on. And it's not that a mistake that he just left it. He left it deliberately because he often made corrections. He would scrape the plate and make a correction. He chose not to correct this, but to leave both. Because there are many prints where large area has been changed, and he scrapes and gets that area smooth again and makes the cuts into the copper a second time, afresh. Chose not to do this here and to leave both arms. Makes viewers more active. You think about it. What's the effect? Young, 21 years old. That's graduating from college equivalent. Living at that time in the university town, like Middlebury, living of Leiden. St. Paul in prison. St. Paul writing, St. Paul reading. And he is imagining, usually you see St. Paul either reading or writing, normal writing, active writing. Here, St. Paul has transferred the pen to his left hand. He is thinking, musing. He has one sandal on, the other one off. An idea came to him probably in the process of dressing, and he forgot about taking the shoes on or off, interrupted that, and is lost in thought. But it's not, that he's just smoothly reading or smoothly writing. He's grappling with something. And so here's a young man trying to suggest a much more complex state for St. Paul, who wrote the famous epistles to Corinthians and so on, while he's in prison. Very unusual choice of pose and situation. Okay, one of these is by a Rembrandt pupil, one by Rembrandt. Hannah, the prophetess, reading, Old Testament figure. Differences. Just for yourself, pick up the differences. Text. Go ahead, someone. Someone say something about the differences between the two. Faces.
Would you use the same nose, the same straight nose?
Might be the same model, Rembrandt's mother. One of the artists is his pupil and one is Rembrandt.
This one's nearsighted.
Yes, as many people must have been. Okay,
Well,
yes?
she's following, the left one is following the words with her fingertips.
Yes, but obviously not Braille. So what's the point of that?
More of a, she's feeling more of a connection.
She's feeling more of a connection. The face is shadowed somewhat. She's turned away from the light, but light reflects a little bit back on her face. It's subtle. There isn't a strong reflection. And she's touching the book lightly. Here she's holding and she's just reading. This suggests that there's a contact. How do you suggest contact? She's absorbed, she's touching it, and the light is reflecting back on her face from the book. And that is the Rembrandt version. And this is the much more prosaic, straightforward, I am reading. And you can see what text, actually you can identify the text. I am reading a book. And here it's more, I'm absorbing, it's having an impact on me internally. I'm being illuminated by it. Those are slight suggestions that are made by the difference. Ganymede, usually shown as a beautiful adolescent or young man, being lifted up by Jupiter's eagle, mythological story, to be the cupbearer. Jupiter was interested in women and men. But this is a little child, a very unusual age for Ganymede. And he is obviously unhappy at being so privileged as to be chosen by Jupiter. And Rembrandt, the face shows that he's unhappy. But the urine coming out in a stream, that shows that it's the startling surprise and fear, the momentary effect of that. And that's very unusual. You have little fountain boys who are urinating. That's common. But in this situation, it's extremely unusual, and it shows the suddenness and the physical and emotional reaction to being taken away from the parents and by this huge bird. Oh, here's the identification, blinding of Samson, another early work. Oops, back. Rembrandt is trying to be like Rubens here. He's borrowing a pose. Samson being blinded, then the sword going right into his eyes. Rembrandt said to the person who received this, hang it in strong light so it can be seen well. It's going right into the eyes, hands closed, clenched, but this is the interesting part. The toes of the feet are bending. The strain is in the whole body. And the Delilah who betrayed Samson, fascinated, looking back with a look of wide-eyed sort of horror fascination at what her work has achieved. I think it's important to acknowledge that he doesn't always get it just right. Looking at this, it's a beautifully painted work. All the textures of clothing and so on, just as technical work, it is superb. What's the emotion? There is a cup being brought to a woman. Now, there are only two possibilities that have been seriously entertained. One is that it's Artemisia who is going to swallow the ashes of her dead husband, mausoleum, and make her own body a mausoleum for him by swallowing his ashes. In which case, she looks like, I'm not sure I'm up to this. Or it's Sophonisba who's about to take a poisoned cup and drink it. Which also the expression is not very convincing as the fear that someone would have or the determination to drink this poison. Emotionally, it just doesn't work for some reason. So even Rembrandt wasn't always successful in that attempt. Details, familiar works. Raphael's School of Athens, huge composition, many figures, and Plato and Aristotle under an arch in the center, both talking at the same time. Plato and Aristotle, things of this earth, the contrast. Rembrandt, they're also in an arch, night watch, lots of people, asymmetrical. One talks, unless it's a scene where the subject is chaos and multiple people talking. Rembrandt has the captain talking, presentation of evidence gesture, the lieutenant listening. Captain's hand throws a shadow on the lieutenant. There's a speaker, there's a listener, very different states internally. Or here, same thing, Christ speaking, and the various reactions. Oh, you know what? This screen has a texture. That's part of I think. It's not a totally smooth screen. No? I mean, it feels like there's anyhow. Different reactions. This woman seems totally absorbed. He seems skeptical. Different reactions of different listeners. And the child who couldn't care less and is drawing in the sand. So giving you a range of reactions, internal reactions or non-reactions to what Christ is saying. Now, Rembrandt over time. These are two paintings of the same subject. New Testament parable, the return of the prodigal son. The son who took his birthright, left home, and had a jolly time in taverns with prostitutes, spent all his money, then tried to help with a farmer, was eating the food that was thrown to the swine, became thoroughly miserable, and decided to come home and said, "Father, take me as one of your servants." And the parable is that the father rushes out. He's overjoyed that the son is back. Rembrandt had one son and then a daughter late in life from his second partner. But they had several children, Saskia and he, but they died except for Titus. So Rembrandt did have a son with whom one doesn't know the feelings, but perhaps influenced this. But not yet, wasn't born yet. The early scene is one of action. Window swings open, the servants looking out what's happening, servants rushing out with new clothes for the son, and the father hurrying. You can see he's still stepping, and the son is, they're a triangle, And the expressions are very intense. Everyone's expressions are very intense. The late Rembrandt, he dies in 69. This is late 60s. No action, no setting. You actually don't really, except for steps, a little arch or something. You don't know where this is. If there's an outside, if it's inside, you really don't know. The setting doesn't matter. It's just people. And the expressions are all calm. The father, eyes closed. It's just the moment of totally feeling the presence of the son back. And, not active rejoicing, just the two bodies close together. The elder son, according to the parable, was very upset because the father gave this big feast of celebration. He said, I've spent all this time helping you, working hard. You never gave a feast for me. But he's been really misspending his life and his inheritance, and you welcome him back with a feast. And the parable is, he who is lost, like the sinner who was lost, has come back, has been saved. That's why we're celebrating. I suspect this is the older son who is standing there with mixed feelings at what he is seeing. These people are there as witnesses of this emotion. Here they're actively playing a role of providing clothing, of rushing out to see what needs to be done. Here, everybody is still. Rembrandt stills things down and tries to convey emotion without motion, which for a Renaissance artist would be very strange. How do you convey emotion without motion? Motion is crucial to convey it. Part of the influence is actually Indian miniatures that have very still figures. He copied 20-some of them, and they're very still. And he's getting a sense that things can be significant without making them very active. Abraham's sacrifice, Old Testament. Abraham finally, in old age, had a child, he and Sarah. A miracle. She was well past childbearing age. Two old people, beloved son, and God tells him, sacrifice your son to me. Death. And Kierkegaard writes about this most movingly, how horrible it must have been for Abraham to travel with the son to the mountain, where they will go onto the top of the mountain and he will sacrifice the son. Early Rembrandt, it's a scene of violent action. Abraham's hand was up in the air with the knife. This is really, that's a hand clamped on the head to keep it down. Feels like such a cruel, violent gesture. And the angel comes swooping in and grabs the hand, and the knife falls. So everything is through movement here. Zigzagging, curving movement. Late Rembrandt. Still, horizontals and verticals. There are the people in the distance. You know that it's high up. The father embraces the son and covers the eyes gently, presses him to himself, holds the sword. It's like, hand on the child, the sword. And it's like suspended for a minute. The angel comes and embraces Abraham. Here's one hand, here's the other hand, and stops both, the hand with the sword, and will lift the hand on the eyes, saying, it's fine. God accepts that you were willing to make the sacrifice. Your son is, can go home with you. Very different interpretation. Minimal action here. And these eyes, you just have the sense of how horrible it must have been for the father to be imagining what he had to do because it was God's will. And the angel too, such a serious expression. how did people react to a comparison of two works? This is Judas, early. Rembrandt is what, 1606, 20, he's 23. The priests, 30 pieces of silver that were given to Judas to betray Christ. He has come back, he's repentant. He throws the silver down, says, take back your money. Now, here is a very important person to the Constantine Huygens, who was secretary, sort of like Secretary of State almost. That single gesture of Judas, he thought this was such an impressive painting. He thought Rembrandt was so impressive in being able to depict emotions. And he talks about his frightful visage, hair torn, rent garment, his arms twisted, hands clenched, fallen to his knees, body whole contorted, pathetic despair. I'm not reading every word, but obviously he's pointing to various parts of the body that are showing how awful Judas feels at what he has done, betraying Christ. Now, this is a very still painting, late, a feast, a dinner, not much food visible. This is towards the end. Esther, her husband Ahasuerus, king of Persia, and Haman. She has just dropped a bombshell verbally on the table. She has said to her husband, who didn't know, I am Jewish, and Haman is plotting to kill all Jews in the country. He has a secret plot to do that. She had no idea how Ahasuerus would react. No idea at all. She was doing this to save her people. Now, Haman, profile, shadowed, greater distance. He's wearing a Turkish turban. Ahasuerus, a Persian turban, small turban. He's diminished. He obviously knows. This is a moment where things are in the balance. Ahasuerus is lifting his scepter, and Esther is quietly just sitting there. This is the way other artists depicted it. Same time, 1660s. Ahasuerus, furious at what he has heard, he puts Haman to death, actually. He orders that. Haman, obviously knowing that his end is coming, pose of depression here, slumped body, and Esther, sincerity, pointing to her chest here. So very dramatic reactions, telling you the story. Same subject. Rembrandt's, like Braque and Picasso, worked together often when they were young. Jan Levens and Rembrandt, when they were young, worked together, shared a studio. This is Levens, an early work. And clenched fists of Ahasuerus, accusation pointing by Esther, and drawing back shadowed Haman with the mouth open, eyes wide, fear. Emotions very legible, straightforward. This is the way the poet Jan Vos wrote about the Feast of Esther, about this painting specifically by Rembrandt. There's a meal shared, and Haman, his breast is full of grief and pain. He bites his heart, he eats the food, but bites his heart in twain. Ahasuerus is obsessed by wrath and rages stink. The fury of the prince is fearful and full blast. We don't see that in the body actions. People knew the story, and looking at that scene, they would process Ahasuerus is closer to Esther. They're both in the light. The gulf here, the shadow, the greater bent pose, the smallness of this figure, the lifted scepter. It's like the anger that is about to burst. It's the moment before the fury really becoming open. And it's a very different presentation of that situation. You look at it and you have to try to figure out what is going on. In the other artists' works, you're told it's a very straightforward narrative what is going on. Late Rembrandt doesn't give you such a straightforward narrative. He makes you try to project yourself into that situation, imagine it, because everyone knew the story. People read the Bible, the Dutch read the Bible at home, out loud. So it was a very familiar narrative. So you're looking at something that you know and figuring out what is going on there. Aristotle, the first painting that sold in the world, that sold for over $1 million at the Met. The line at the Met was out of the building, stretching down the street. You can go now, and there's usually no one in front of it. So what is going on? It used to be called Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer. But he's not looking at it. It is Aristotle wearing the dark sort of apron, stands for melancholy. He was one of those melancholic geniuses. But he isn't really contemplating the bust of Homer. He's touching it. He's in contact with it. He's turned towards it. But he's looking into space. By the way, Rembrandt signed himself on the Homer bust. Right here, it says Rembrandt. And his other hand is touching this fabulous golden chain with the medal of a portrait of Alexander, Emperor Alexander, who was his pupil, Aristotle's, former. And how does one interpret this? The two hands. One hand on the bust of the poet, the life of the mind, and the other hand on secular power. I think the most plausible interpretation is that it is the choice between the two modes. Which do you pick? You can't have both. And the turning towards this, and the fact that the bust is on his right hand, and Rembrandt signed himself here, suggests, that's the choice, but it is suggesting that there are two possibilities. 17th century philosophers, people who we'd say are interested in psychology, were exploring mixed emotions, being pulled towards something and away from it. In the Renaissance, they were interested in more straightforward emotions. Anger, fear, joy, things that were one category. With the 17th century, those are still of interest, but also a move from one to another, a being pulled back and forth between two emotions. I want such and such, and I know it's awful for me. I want it. I want that, the back and forth, the vacillation. Rembrandt tries to suggest that, I think, here in the Aristotle. With that earlier Ledicant, there were two arms to suggest two different possible states. Here, there are only two arms, not an extra arm. There are two arms here, and each one touches a different object to suggest two different choices, two different feelings of wanting this and wanting that. Denial of Peter. Anyone know the biblical story? Okay. Christ had predicted, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. Peter, no, absolutely not, Lord. I will die for you. So he's confronted by a servant girl with soldiers around, Roman soldiers around, and she says, weren't you one of Christ's followers? Peter says, no, I wasn't. Rembrandt is depicting that moment. Now, turned towards the servant girl, his right hand on his chest, but all covered. It's really hidden in his robe. Because when you put your hand on your chest, that's, in the 17th century, it means I'm sincere, believe me. I don't know if politicians still do that. Maybe they do. It's coming from the heart. And the other hand is out, like that. Now, a hand like this is presentation of evidence. We saw Captain Cock in the Night Watch. A hand like this, it's saying. Now, the main point here is, but this hand is not out like that. It couldn't hold evidence. It's like this. It's sideways. You see the palm. Now, if you look up from the hand, there's a figure here with soldier near him who's looking back. Very important to notice that figure. It's Christ. So on one side you have the accusation, on the other side you have Christ. On one side you have the hand on the heart but hidden. On the other you have the hand with the evidence, but the evidence is, the hand is sideways. It's like the evidence has slipped. It doesn't exist. I didn't know him. I don't know the man. Now, on the web, the image was actually, the best image was this one, reversed. The whole composition makes a big difference. In literate societies in the West, we read images, we jump around, the light attracts us first, but we tend to go from left to right. So we start with the accusation, and we do notice Christ on the right. If it is like this, reversed, you tend to pass over this side much more quickly, and you linger here, and you stay here where the light is. You don't really pick up Christ, and if you don't pick up Christ, you don't realize that Peter is confronting a choice. We know what he chose, but it's the choice between staying true to Christ, who is looking back at him, or betraying Christ. And the two hands suggest that. But the turn of the body suggests which choice he makes. But he is torn between the two. That's what interests Rembrandt, not just the no. Bathsheba, 1654, the last work we're going to look at. Bathsheba, whose husband is off at war, and King David has seen her bathing in her own private garden, and he's rather taken with her and has sent her a letter inviting her to his bed. Now, this is Rubens's version of that. There's David. Here's the messenger coming with the letter. The dog reacts. Here she is in the garden, pretty attractive, sexy, the breasts on display, the legs, plumpness was in the 17th century. Women were not expected, in fact, the slimness of today would have been considered very unfortunate for a woman. So she was a beauty. And we have the whole story here. And her reaction is one, what is this? There's no David, no palace. We're not sure where anything is. We see luxurious clothing, a servant. And her pose is not a pose that is arranging the body for maximum attractiveness. It's a rather awkward pose that she's sitting. Her head is bent, and there's the letter. It's very important that it's within the contour of her body. It's not external to her body. That makes a difference. And the other hand is on her clothing. The letter, the invitation to the king, and the clothing would cover her up, stay with the husband. She does go to the king. She gets pregnant. The child dies, punishment from God. Her husband is killed in the war because King David makes sure that he is. Now, contemporary of Rembrandt, same year, this is his version of Bathsheba. It's what David saw, imagine that he saw the physical attraction. And all the light, everything is focused on the breast and the inviting face. Here, it's the body, but all of the body, and not idealized that way. In fact, some people on the web call this an ugly figure, which is sort of strange. I mean, it's just a normal human being. And here's the letter. The letter is important. There, the letter is much more peripheral. This is an X-ray of the head. This is the present head. That's the way it had been. Rembrandt had her looking up initially, as if she were noticing David. As in this early Susanna, when she becomes aware that elders are sneaking up and watching her. The looking out. So the head had been raised and looking out. He drops the head. There's no awareness, in terms of physical glance. Obviously, there is internal awareness, mental awareness. The whole body, X-rays are individual sheets, pasted together here. The whole body had been a little more covered. He uncovers it. So he shows you more of the body, but he doesn't arrange it to look sexy. It's just body is there, physical presence fully. Now, wait a second, I had one more. Now, where did it go? Shoot. No? Oh, drat. Okay. Well, it disappeared. But I'll tell you what I had a portrait of Hendrike, who was his common law wife. She came as a servant to take care of the son, and she became, basically common law wife. Neighbors thought of her as his common law wife. Well, in 1654, the year that this painting, Rembrandt produced it, Hendrike was called by the Calvinist Church to appear before the church council for living, this is quoting, living in whoredom with Rembrandt because they were not married. 3 times the summons came. Someone came to the house. I don't know if there was a letter or if it was just verbal. The church council wants you to appear. Took 3 times before she finally appeared. And she was given the choice. Either leave Rembrandt or you can't attend the Lord's Supper, which was serious, in terms of your spiritual life. She stayed with Rembrandt. I wonder if while he's painting this work, and has initially her looking up, the summons doesn't come during that time. And whether her thinking, as she's posing for Rembrandt, because the portrait of Hendrike, you would see, the head is very similar. It's, she was the model for Rembrandt, also a cheap model. She was right there, patient model. But I think it's plausible, we don't know, since the summons came 3 times, that while he's doing this work, the summons comes. Hendrike is obviously actively thinking, what do I do? Because it takes her 3, knocks on the door before she finally complies. And her absorption with this, and it's a choice. She knows what the choice is, leave Rembrandt or leave the church, basically. And wrestling with that choice, and Bathsheba, I think Rembrandt becomes more acutely aware of Bathsheba's choice while he's painting this work, and at least certainly becomes fascinated with the much more internal processes of Bathsheba rather than the physical being observed and admired by the king. And here's just Rembrandt to end with, and whether he was himself a very generous person, perceptive about other people, we don't know, but he knew how to depict it. Some artists are very strong at being observed certain things, even if they don't live accordingly, but they can depict that, they can write it. There may be a contradiction between their life or a consistency, but the work of Rembrandt is really, I think, remarkable in how actively he keeps returning to human beings and their internal states and tries to understand it and record it. Questions? Oops. Yes.
How did
Please.
Rembrandt know what he looked like? Did he look in a mirror?
Yes, they had mirrors. They did have mirrors, and at Versailles, 17th century, that's later, but the full walls of mirrors. But yes, there are paintings with people looking in mirrors. Mirrors exist all along. They're just become better and better. The convex mirrors in the 15th century, and then the mirrors get flatter and larger and clearer. So yes, there were good mirrors.
So what we're looking at is a mirror image.
Mirror image, exactly. He looks in the mirror and depicts himself. Yeah, over and over. Yes?
What was the point of doing the x-rays?
Oh, because it's fascinating. It's part of the working process. What did he change? He doesn't have many studies for works, very few for specific works. So how do you're trying to imagine, how is he getting at this? And if in the X-ray you see changes, well, he chose to change certain things. Like here, he chose to change the I'm looking up and noticing, being admired, to, looking out into space and thinking and trying to deal with the situation internally. So the X-rays just tell you that he had a choice and he rejected that more conventional choice for this one. Yes?
Given the influence of the biblical stories in his work, what was the influence of institutional religion in his personal life?
We have no idea about his faith. There is just no, he painted Mennonites, he painted Jews, he painted Catholics, obviously Calvinists. His mother apparently was Catholic. I've read in one source. I don't know if that's reliable or not. So we don't know about his own religious convictions. He wasn't called by the church council, which suggests he wasn't an active member of the church. So yeah, all these biblical stories, but we can't attribute a faith to him on the basis of the evidence that exists. You think that he was fervently devout in a specific religion, and maybe he was, but there's no evidence of it. No records of him attending a church, of anything like that. Yes?
Who was Rembrandt painting for? For rich patrons or just to sell on his own? Or?
The prince went all over Europe. His paintings sold to very high nobility as well as middle-class people. So you have the range from, there were a lot of prosperous what we would call middle-class people in the Netherlands, merchants and so on. And they invested in land, they invested in tulips, and they invested a lot in art. So his commissions, and occasionally from abroad. The Aristotle was painted for an Italian, for Ruffo, an Italian nobleman. So occasionally international commissions, but largely local commissions, but from the Constantine Huygens is very high placed, and merchants also. So for the open market and for patrons, specific patrons, portraits were commissioned. The larger paintings would have been commissioned because they're too costly to just. There were dealers. This is the century where professional dealers, as intermediaries between artists and the buying public, when they do become dealers who are professionals. That's the start of it, the dealer as the middleman. And Rembrandt must have sold some things through dealers, but largely, I think, to individuals, as had been true in the past. Yes?
How early did the appearance of emotion show up in paintings? Was what was going on when he was painting, everyone was using emotion in their paintings? Or was he an anomaly?
No, like we saw the Bernini David. Yeah. Bernini has emotion, in a number of his sculptures. Art, no, it's common. I mean, artists have been interested in depicting emotion as soon as naturalism starts becoming a greater trend, which is in the 15th century, 16th century. It's the way that they depict emotion and what emotions they choose to depict that changes. But they are interested in doing this. It's part of a greater naturalism, depict the world around you. But you can't depict everything, so there are always choices.
When he chose to depict emotions, how was it different from what had preceded him?
He grappled more actively with emotions that were mixed rather than clear-cut, especially in his old age. It's not unique to him, but he does it more than other artists. And he has, I'd say, a wider range of emotions, from the boredom to the frustration to the anger to the I want this and I want that at the same time. The range is extremely wide. So other artists are interested in emotions. He pursues it, I think, more actively, more intensively, in more varied ways. Anything else? Yes?
So what would the process be like if you were a merchant and you went to Rembrandt and said, I'd like to have my portrait done, but I want it really look good.
Yeah.
Don't make me look old or show my warts or whatever. Or was it, I'm going to tell you what I think you are?
We do know that he was not easy with people who wanted things from him. He would delay finishing, or not insist that it wasn't finished until he said it was finished. Or Rufo complained, this doesn't look finished. He said, I consider it finished. It will cost you extra if you wanted more finished. But he was not nice to, from the few records we have, he was not. In other words, he insisted that he knew what was right. You can read it positively or read it negatively. Yes?
Was that not some of the case with the Night Watch, that as a guild painting it wouldn't be a success? It didn't show everyone clearly, it didn't demonstrate.
Well, the fact that it's a failure is considered a myth now. People paid depending on how visible they were. So you'd pay a lot more if you were full face and more important in the guild. Obviously, the captain, lieutenant paid the most. And it was hung in a very prominent place, and in the guild hall. And when it was cut down, and it was cut down quite a bit, it was more asymmetrical, it was moved to the city hall. It was common to cut paintings down to fit locations or fit frames. No one thought that throwing several feet of Rembrandt away was a sacrilege. Not a big deal. So it was moved to the city hall, which is hardly being a failure. He was less popular as he got old because the smooth French style came in, a more idealized style, smoother, sort of Poussin influence, classical influence, French influence, and he persisted in a style that was rough, but there were still important people who commissioned things from him. Yes?
I'm just curious about the story. Why has he didn't marry this woman instead of her being given the choice of portrait versus...
Because then now this you can read, various ways. His first wife's will specified that if he remarried, he would lose the money that was, from her. Now, was she a very jealous sort and wanted to make sure that he was hers alone forever? Or was it because she didn't trust him, or what? We don't know, but the will specified that if he remarried, there would be a huge financial, a substantial financial loss for him. So that's usually considered to be the reason.
I just wonder, he painted at a time when there were so many very good painters.
Yes.
And his competition was incredible. And
Yes.
I wondered how you rank him against
I think Rubens was a very different type of person, and really international success, public art. Rembrandt his public art is the guild portraits, and a painting for the city hall that was rejected, a big history painting, was rejected. We don't know why, but it was put up and it came down, and they probably wanted changes he refused to make. So I think, they're just so different. They're both great. I think Rembrandt is incredibly good. I don't whatever, I have no idea about his character, but I think in his art, he is just so complex. And touching. I mean, a lot of the work, I mean, you can describe it as heart-twanging if you want to see it as sentimental, but I think a lot of it is really quite profound. And yes?
Rembrandt is clearly one of the most popular artists now.
Still.
Could you say something about the history of his reception from the 17th century?
He was very successful as a young man, less so as an older man. In the 18th century, it's the early Rembrandts that are popular, not the late Rembrandts. 19th century with Romanticism, it's the late Rembrandt and the one who gets at what's in the soul that becomes important. That continues into to the mid-20th century, and then gradually there's this sort of questioning of Rembrandt. What was he like? Which are really his works? Isn't he overranked? Gary Schwartz, whose name is Dark. He's the one who's the most active in attacking Rembrandt. And if you want to read Gary Schwartz's biography of Rembrandt, he's got several Rembrandt books. He's the one who reads every document in the worst way possible. But the curious thing is the parallelism. I haven't had time, and I'm never going to do it, to really see which comes first. But as Rembrandt's life is considered noble, or it's considered to be rather despicable, the work is in favor, or the work is less in favor. People want the life and the work to go hand in hand. And when they really like the work, they see the life in a favorable light. And when they dislike the work, they find fault with the life. And that's the pattern in the reception. Anything else? Yes? Oh, he does have depictions of children, especially drawings. Mothers with children, a lot of depictions of mothers with children. They do tend to be prints and drawings rather than paintings. And his young son, some very tender paintings of Titus, which I couldn't show. So yes, he does. Not other people's children. I don't think his style really lends itself to bringing, to depicting children that much, maybe. Yeah. Although in portraits, he's more conventional. He doesn't, because that's the market there. Yes?
Did his son Titus live to adulthood?
Hendrike died, I think, in 1660. I think Titus dies in 63, probably of the plague, and Rembrandt dies in 69. Everyone who's close to, those two people who were closest to him die well before him.
But leaving an inheritance to his son would not have been, or might have been a reason for
Might have
not
been.
marrying.
May have been. Yeah, that's, one can think of various angles on that fact that of the specification in her will. Anything else?
I noticed that there seem to be some threads from mannerism with the gestures and with the lighting. Was there a conscious connection there, or was it just sort of in the air?
Was there a connection with mannerism because some gestures, lighting? His lighting is often not at all naturalistic, especially in the late works. The light comes from, you can't identify a source. So it's not completely naturalistic, rational light, which is like mannerism, but mannerism wasn't that admired at the time. And the artists that he copies in drawings, and he has whole files of prints, they tend to be Renaissance artists, 15th, 16th century artists. Italians and Northerners, but not much of mannerism. So I think that would be simply that there are times where he neglects naturalism because he's after something else, and light, as you mentioned, is one of those, especially in the later works.
question on the aging of paintings. These paintings are 300 or 400 years old now. What might they have looked like originally? And how do they look today compared to the original, or don't we know?
Oh, gosh. Oh, we have a conservator here.
I was thinking about your answer.
Could
repeat
you-
the question?
Paintings, how would they have looked different? Would they have looked different? They would have looked different. But how would one summarize that? Could you turn around and speak so you could be heard?
With somebody like Rembrandt in particular, they may have been even brighter and higher contrast than they are now. He used a lot of varnish and wax mixed into the paint to give it that wonderful luminescence and transparency. And that darkens somewhat over the years when you dare not try to get to reverse that process. So even when they're fully cleaned, which Rembrandt's probably never should be, they're probably still a little more muted and a little darker and yellower than they originally would have been.
Thank you. Vermeer is the one who's, some of whose paintings have suffered the most because there's a green that is very fugitive. So you have blue leaves in say a Vermeer, the house in Delft, which used to look green because the yellow has completely faded and it's only the blue part of the green that has survived. So occasionally the whole color scheme is shifted. Okay, just one more thing. All of these paintings were produced and exhibited in light that was not strong. In museums now, the light is often strong. And it's the cones of the eyes that are more active when there's strong light. It's rods that become more active when it's dimmer light. Our eyes are experiencing these paintings under light conditions that are too bright. And I think that affects also how they would have been seen and how we see them, aside from all the physical changes. Okay, thank you so much for coming.